Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about Uranus and Gemini in the United States, and specifically the history of astrologers making predictions about Uranus and Gemini coinciding with major wars in the history of the country over the past few centuries. All right, so right now I'm recording this today on, it's Sunday, July 6th, 2025, starting at 8:28 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, just at sunset before the sun goes down, and it's the eve of Uranus moving into Gemini, which is going to happen later tonight, technically on the 7th of July, 2025, but just in a few hours here. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Astrologers have been anticipating it. I've been anticipating it for many years, and now we're finally here. So this is a big deal because astrologers for quite some time now have noticed this correlation where every 84 years, when Uranus moves into the sign of Gemini, where it spends for about 7 years, the U.S. is involved in a major war. And in fact, there's been 3 major instances of this so far in U.S. history. So here's a diagram that Madeline Decotes from honeycomb.co made for me to help demonstrate this. So the first time in U.S. history that's relevant when Uranus was in Gemini was from 1774 until 1782, and this pretty well coincided with the Revolutionary War, when America declared its independence and fought a war of independence from Great Britain. Then 84 years later, when Uranus went through all the other signs of the zodiac and then eventually came back around to Gemini, where it was when the country was founded, it was in Gemini from 1858 until 1866, which very nicely coincided with the Civil War. Then 84 years later, Uranus goes through all the signs and it comes back eventually in a full cycle from 1941 until 1949, which coincided with the US's entry into World War II and the culmination of that war. Then finally, 84 years later, brings us to now, which is Uranus is going into Gemini tonight and tomorrow, July 7th, 2025, and it's going to stay in Gemini until 2033. So that pattern and that repetition has been known about for as long as I've been an astrologer. I've been studying astrology since 1999, which is over 25 years now, and I know astrologers have been talking about this and have known about this repetition since at least then, and we've talked about it many, many times on the podcast over the years, especially on the forecast episodes, but
what up,
also
Stash?
2 episodes entirely dedicated to studying that pattern.
What's up, brother?
In history.
I'm back, brother.
Nick Dig and Best.
I'm back from the
first
dead.
one was episode 11 of the Astrology Podcast.
I'm back.
In 2013, and then in 2022.
Appreciate it, my brother. Yeah.
More detailed treatment of looking at that pattern and that repeating cycle in history.
What's up, man?
So, one of the things
What up, Big
I've been
Stash?
researching lately in order to take stock of this and give some perspective to
I like your new
people
name. You
in
no
terms
obligation
of
to switch it back,
the
Ogby.
history of predictions surrounding
Follow your heart.
this cycle
What, brother?
is the question of, how long have astrologers been aware of these repetitions, and how long have they been making predictions about it, about the future of the U.S.
Yeah, buddy.
based on
I like 'em
this
both.
recurring cycle? And the answer to that question is actually really interesting because it
Thanks,
turns
man.
out that
Thanks, homie.
it goes back to the first repetition and the second repetition. And there's 2 astrologers, very notable astrologers in U.S. history that I want to talk about today.
I realized after I changed my name to Megalithic China on Twitch,
Gemini,
I streamed literally 0 hours
right as the
of
US was on
megalithic
the
China
cusp of
content.
first the Civil War,
Like,
which is the first
I
time
didn't
an
do anything.
astrologer
I
named
didn't stream a
Luke
single
Broughton
stream
first
about
seems to have
like
noticed and
China megaliths at all,
documented
not once.
and made some
And it's like,
predictions
what I'm like,
about the Civil
okay,
War
I
based
gotta
on that transit.
rethink
And then again,
things.
84 years later, there was an astrologer
Maybe that's
named
not who I
Evangeline
am,
Adams,
right?
who was a famous astrologer
That's
in
interesting
America,
too.
perhaps the most famous astrologer of her day, and she made a prediction about
But yeah,
World
man.
War II starting.
Bro,
about
I'm
a
going back to
decade
China
before it
next week, man.
happened, based on the Uranus
I'm flying
return to
back
the
next
United
week.
States, which was impending at that point.
I'm planning to bring my
So
64. I'm bringing
those
2
origins of
suitcases.
those
I'm planning to bring my
predictions,
64 and my
and,
Switch.
I also want to ground it a little bit in the
Bro, the
chart
Switch has
that
been
we look at
amazing
for
for
the
my
United
mental health.
States and like why that is.
Dude, Tears of the
And then,
Kingdom is
of
such a
course,
good game.
talk
It's
a
crazy.
little bit about the context towards the
It's
end
like
where
Breath
we
of the
find
Wild,
ourselves
right?
today.
How long?
Alright,
Thanks, man.
so
Thanks, brother.
where do we start? Let's start with
I'm
the
going
Sibley
for
chart
a
of the
2-year
United States,
contract.
or the birth chart of the United States.
Yeah, it
because I
really
think this
is.
is where you have to
2-year
start
contract,
and
planning to come back
understand
at
why
Christmas.
this has been the particular
I gotta pay off my
manifestation
debt,
that it,
man,
that it often
in
is
Canada.
for the United States. So the United States.
So
in the
I'm
United
12
States, we
hours
commonly
difference.
celebrate the birth of
So I might be
the
streaming
United
at like
States based
4
on the
a.m.
signing of the Declaration
Sorry.
of Independence, which is traditionally celebrated on July 4th, 1776. And then every year, the U.S. holds birthday celebrations.
Car in
on
4
that
years,
day.
others in 1 year. Nice, man.
There are
Oh,
different,
Joe,
like,
that's sick, man.
arguments about what the
That's
correct
great.
chart
That's where you have
is
a
for the
plan. If you have
United
a
States, and
plan,
whether
it's
there's other
that's
dates
like
that
half
could be
the
considered or used, or especially different
half the
rising
struggle. No, it's
signs,
not half
because
the
there's a lot
struggle,
of
but I
debate
mean,
over the correct rising sign for the United
it stops
States, because we
the
don't have an
bleeding,
exact
as they say.
record of when the signing of the Declaration of Independence happened on July
Wow,
4th,
cool, bro.
1776.
Congrats, man. Yeah, like
But
that's what
one of the
I'm.
most commonly used
I gotta
charts
start saving for
I'll,
like retirement,
talk
bro.
about
I'm
and
gonna be
I'll use for
40
the
next
purpose of
year,
this
man.
is
I
the
gotta start
Sibley
saving for
chart that has
retirement, so
Sagittarius
it's gonna be.
rising. And my purpose
So I'm gonna
isn't
be
to
a
get
long
debates
haul
about
with this
the
debt.
time, but primarily
Honestly, I don't know though.
we're gonna focus on just the.
But if we're talking
key bars of
percentages, like my
Uranus in
lowest
this
debt
chart
percentage
today,
is
and
like
the birth time
15%,
itself is
right?
kind of somewhat
Annual.
immaterial. All right,
So I'm not getting any investment
here is
returns
the Sibley
above
chart of the United
15%,
States, or the birth chart of the
independent of
United
like
States,
real estate or
set
some
for July
shit, which I'm
4th,
not doing.
1776.
No, man, just credit card debt.
So one of the things that we can see is that Uranus was in Gemini.
Just
in the
living
birth
debt,
chart of
man.
the
I've been
United
unemployed
States.
for like
So that's
4
one of
years.
the reasons that it sets up that pattern, because that means
Been unemployed
every
for
84
4 years.
Uranus is going to come back to its natal position when it goes through Gemini.
Oh wow, nice,
But
bro.
there's something additionally
Yeah, that's not much at
important
all.
about that placement that makes it unique, besides just Uranus being in Gemini, and it's actually the fact that Uranus is conjunct the planet
Nice, bro.
Mars, which is also in Gemini at 21 degrees of that sign. And although they're kind of far away from each other by degree, they're still what I would call co-present in that sign together, and therefore their energies are being blended together in a significant way. So Mars is typically the planet of like war and conflict and division traditionally, going back to ancient times, whereas Uranus is a relatively newly discovered planet that was discovered
Thanks, man.
a few centuries ago,
Use the money for rent instead, I
around
hear
the
you.
time when the United States was founded. And as a result of that,
Yeah, dude,
astrologers
I
over
don't
the past
plan
couple
to
of
drive in China.
centuries have
Fucking China
repeatedly
drivers are
seen
insane.
Uranus and
They're
its
crazy
placement in
drivers, man.
charts,
They're the
as well as
craziest
its
drivers.
transits, be associated with
You have no idea what they're gonna do.
revolutionary things, with sudden urges for freedom and liberation.
You've seen, yeah, bro,
with
dude.
unexpected changes and sometimes
Like,
disruptive
it's-
changes and upsets.
I'm talking about in China,
and
right? I'm not
things that are,
saying
like,
Chinese here.
surprising or eccentric
I'm not racist,
or
right?
other things like
Saying
that.
like in China,
So
bro,
when
they're
you
crazy.
put
They're
Mars
crazy.
and Uranus together in a chart, it can be kind of a volatile combination.
Miami drivers are
And
pretty
this
crazy
is
too.
something I've been talking about on some of the
But not like
forecast
China.
episodes over the past year.
China was crazy,
We
man.
just had a Mars-Uranus square last month that coincided with a lot of
Yeah, India, bro.
explosions and military actions, like an unexpected military action,
Drivers.
surprise attack against Iran from on the part of Israel and the United States. And then last summer, there were also some explosive things that occurred under a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. So one of the things about that Mars-Uranus conjunction then is it puts this kind of explosive, divisive energy right in the birth chart of the United States. And on the one hand, you know, there can be things about the Mars-Uranus conjunction that are can be constructive and useful. It can be like bold and like risk-taking and innovative. And some of those things, especially innovative when it comes to like new technologies or transportation or communication methods and other things like that,
Fuck you, man.
are part of that conjunction, and there can be some good things that come from it. But on the flip side,
Yeah,
it can also
bro.
be a
So
very
I need
volatile
to.
conjunction as well, because it can indicate conflict.
I need to.
It can indicate unexpected disruptions. It can indicate other things of the Martian nature.
I need to see what I'm going to bring this time.
War and conflict, but it kind of gets amplified and magnified.
I would like to play on an HDMI TV. It was really hard to find
So one of the interesting things about
CRT.
this conjunction, though, is that every year when the U.S. celebrates its birthday,
I mean, it's not that hard.
It's unique, I think, among the
You can buy one
countries,
online,
because in the U.S. we have this
but I never did.
tradition
Like a
going back,
used
I
one.
think, to the very first,
So if it was
birthday
broken,
celebration of the U.S.,
it wouldn't
where
work.
Americans
It'd
all
be a
across
waste
the
of
country
money.
start setting off fireworks, and that's actually a really perfect.
Oh yeah, there's lots. There are.
demonstration
You're
of
right.
the Mars-Uranus
But it's just,
conjunction
I don't know.
and the pivotal role that it plays
I would
in
like
the
to
birth
just
chart, which is
play
just
on
like
a flat
Americans
screen too,
celebrate
if I can
their,
somehow find a zero delay input
independence, and they celebrate the birth
system.
of their country
Even a
by, like,
small one, like a
blowing things
20,
up,
30 inch.
setting off
Not 20
these
inch, but like
beautiful,
ideally
dazzling
32 inch
explosions
screen
and
would be
stuff,
great.
But the other night I was watching, fireworks.
Get it there?
on 4th of July,
Yeah.
like I do every year, and I was looking around from a really high
In
place
Changsha,
in
man.
my city in Denver, and just
In the
seeing
center of the
that,
country,
like,
that's the
so
city
many
name.
hundreds and hundreds of different neighborhoods.
What's the city name,
everywhere I
brother?
could see were all setting off their own fireworks, and then there were other fireworks displays. And so I got
true.
interested, and I looked it up to
You are
see
right.
if this is like common in other countries or if the U.S. was unique for it. And what was coming back was that the U.S. really was unique in terms
China
of the sheer
was PAL,
magnitude of the number of like fireworks
which I think is like
and
50
explosions that are
frames,
set off
or
each year
sorry,
on
not
the 4th
50,
of July.
25
I think that
frames
has
per
a lot
second
to
or
do with
something.
that explosive combination that's built into the birth chart of the United States. All right, so Uranus takes 84 years
Oh wow.
to do a complete
Dang, dude.
cycle through all of the signs of the zodiac and
Be
come
careful, my
back
man.
to where it started in the birth chart of something. So Uranus was first in Gemini during the Revolutionary War, and that sets up the basic.
Where's his
framework
father? I guess you didn't get into
the
that
country,
conversation.
The United States, and it's declaring itself independent from another
Oh,
country.
man.
It's sort of setting the
Might not have a
stage,
father, I just realized.
innovating in that way. But then what happens is about 84 years later, Uranus came back and moved into
My mother's always
Gemini
home and
again
neighbors.
from
I work 2 blocks from
1858 to
here.
1866. And
Oh,
what's
wow.
interesting is during that time frame, there was an astrologer named Luke Broughton, and he was in the 1900s. He became one of the most,
Dang, dude.
like the leading astrologer in America.
Sorry to hear.
One of the most famous astrologers in America and one of the most influential astrologers of his time frame. So let me pull up his dates just to give you more information about him. Luke Broughton lived from 1828 until 1899. And what's interesting about him is that he published an astrological periodical from 1861 until 1869, so that he was basically like publishing this astrological journal or periodical in the decade when the Civil War, like the build up to the Civil War, and then eventually during the Civil War itself. So the Civil War itself happened from April of 1861 until April of 1865. And what's interesting is if you read Luke Broughton's journal, he's like talking about this right from the very first issue of this journal, starting in 1861, that the threat of war is looming over the country and that it seems like it's heading in that direction.
Shoot her.
But in one of the journals in particular, it's Volume 2, number 2, from February of 1861, he has this whole discussion about the planet Uranus and its transits through the sign of Gemini in U.S. history. And Luke Broughton, as far as I can tell, was actually the first astrologer to note this correlation between Uranus and Gemini and major conflicts breaking out in the United States. And he partially based some of his predictions about an upcoming war, which turned into the Civil War, based on that transit of Uranus through Gemini. Because one of the things that he talks about in this article and that he could see at the time was how closely the transit of Uranus and Gemini coincided with the Revolutionary War back in the 1700s. So looking back about 84 years earlier, he could see how close that correlation was. And so based on that past correlation, he realized that that was what was coming up again in the very near future, and that it implied that another major war could be about to take place. But what's further interesting about his article is that
So laggy.
he actually took it
It's
back
so
further
laggy.
in terms of U.S. history, and he noted that there was a period in the 1690s when Uranus was transiting Gemini, and he has a section in his article talking about different things that were happening at that time that he thought were relevant in his time as well. So he pointed out that there was like a conflict that was taking place, which is called nowadays it's called King
come
Leo's
on.
War, and how this
Like, fuck
coincided
you.
pretty closely with Uranus and Gemini in the 1690s.
Could have been peace. I don't know.
He also noted
Like
a few
fucking
other
bollocks.
things. He noted some
It
things
wasn't
about the
peace.
laws that were set up during that time frame.
It
and how
might
that
have been.
ended up influencing the later
I don't know.
entry
It
in terms of
wasn't.
the United States and what it would eventually become.
I don't think it was
Weirdly,
peace.
he also noticed some anti-astrology and anti-fortune
Fucking
telling
boosted
or
into the
like
box.
witchcraft type
It
laws
was so laggy,
that were
though.
coming up back then with the
It was
Salem
really
witch
laggy.
trials, and how he was experiencing some anti-astrology stuff during his time frame. So that's one correlation I'm actually a little nervous about, because I don't know if that's, I haven't looked at that correlation very much, and I hope that's not a recurrence, but that was one other thing that I
16?
noticed that he picked up on in terms of that time frame. So let me show really quickly his journal, because this is something that's out there online that you can go and read a scan of in order to see how he talks about it. All right, so here's the journal where he first published this analysis, which is, again, it's from Broughton's Monthly Planet Reader, an astrological journal, Volume 2, Number 2, published in Philadelphia, February 1st, 1861. So this is what, like 2 months before the Civil War breaks out. And he has this whole article about what he calls the planet Herschel, because back in the early, like the first century of after the discovery of Uranus, there were some debates about what to call it, and some of the astrologers and astronomers called it Herschel. So the article right at the top of the journal is the planet Herschel in the sign Gemini, and it's just so fascinating. At the very beginning of it, he says, in the January number of the Planet Reader, we stated that the sign Gemini rules the United States, and that when the planet Herschel entered that sign in 1775, the American Revolution broke out. And when Herschel got 9 degrees in Gemini, the Americans declared their independence. And when Herschel got out of that sign and entered Cancer in 1782, overtures for peace were made by the British government, which were accepted, and both nations desisted from hostile measures. And we went on to show that when Herschel entered Gemini again in 1859, that the present difficulties commenced by the Harper's Ferry after breaking out. And when Herschel got to 9 degrees of that sign, South Carolina declared her independence. And since our last issue, there have been other 3 of the southern states followed the same course. So he continues, he says, as it is said by astrologers that when the planet Herschel transits over any particular place in a nativity, such as over the 10th house or over the sun's place, it produces remarkable changes and unsettledness for that person. And likewise, when it's traveling through any sign which rules any particular nation or country, it produces very remarkable changes and unsettledness in that nation or country. It perhaps will not be uninteresting to the reader and to the student of astrology to refer back to the time when Herschel entered Gemini previous to 1775, which was in the year 1691, to see whether it produced any remarkable effects in this country or at that time or not. And to avoid any unfairness or equivocation, we will let history speak for itself. And then he does this long quote from like a history text about the charter being granted to Massachusetts, which added Plymouth, Maine, and Nova Scotia to the territory. And he goes on into this long thing, which points out essentially some similarities between even the previous Uranus and Gemini transit before the founding of the United States. So, his research partially shows, and you can take it back, that this goes back to some earlier base birth chart, even prior to the United States, that the pattern holds up in, so that it was something from very early on in the history that's still being carried forward, although we can see it, especially when it comes to like the current incarnation of the United States as a country, in the birth chart itself, with that Mars-Uranus conjunction, with Uranus around 8 degrees of Gemini, which seems to be a particularly sensitive point, especially when Uranus gets back to that degree, but really for the entirety of the transit through that sign. So one of the things I was surprised by is just how
what's up, brother?
Identifying the entire transit through the sign as being significant, and
Thanks,
especially
man.
the transit to the exact degree.
Just for people to know who I am, I guess. Thanks, brother. I was telling Electric Stash that after changing my Twitch name, I streamed exactly 0 minutes of megalithic China content on this channel. I thought I'd be streaming a lot more of it, but
I don't know
no.
if there's other people before him.
Yeah,
but as
really.
far as I know, he seems to be the first astrologer that comes up with this.
It's crazy. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna stream it. People are gonna come.
The Civil War, which is just incredible, because that
I feel like sometimes I'm just like completely delusional about life.
And I think that's important because it's not just that the U.S. is involved
What's up, bro?
a war,
Glad you're hearing it.
sort of war, when the Uranus return happens, but it's literally the three most important wars in U.S. history all took place during this transit, which is like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II. So very occasionally, like, I'll hear somebody try to dismiss this correlation and say, well, the U.S. was involved in other wars, but not to this magnitude and not in terms of this significance, where if you ask any historian, for the most part, what are the three most significant wars in U.S. history, it really comes down to these three in particular. And while somebody might question, like, what about World War I? The U.S. got involved in World War I pretty late. Like World War I had been going on for a few years by the time the U.S. even enters it, and then World War I ends up wrapping up like just about a year after the U.S. gets involved. So while that was a significant war, it wasn't as significant as World War II. And in terms of the overall U.S. history,
yeah, sorry, man, I'm shook. I had a run that I passed away.
The United States as a country, these three wars,
because I got shot into the boxes, and I'm really shook. So I'm just thinking about that run. I'm glad you're here, man.
So it's incredible to me to see this.
I also need to load the vape and
discovering this
put my laundry in the dryer and shit.
Was on the cusp of World War
so I'm gonna do that soon.
And then basing some of his predictions about that war that was about to happen on that, and saying and predicting that a war was about to take place. So that's actually the earliest example I can find, and that sets up the precedent of astrologers predicting and noticing this pattern, and then based on the historical pattern, starting to predict that a major war will occur the next time that Uranus is in Gemini, dating back to the beginning of the Civil War. All right, so the Civil War happens, and then you fast forward to the 1930s, the early 1930s, and there was a very famous astrologer in the early 20th century named Evangeline Adams. And I've done an entire episode on Evangeline Adams with my friend Christopher Renstrom, and we were basing some of our research on the work of another astrologer named Karen Christino, who's written multiple books about Evangeline Adams and just what a popular and influential astrologer she was in the early 20th century. So Evangeline Adams lived from 1861 to 1932. And 1932 is important because...
And also, Need Dreams is right. We need to maintain the classics.
In 1931, that predicted that the U.S. would be involved in a major war starting around 1942, based on the Uranus return of the United States. And the book that she wrote this in is actually in the introduction.
Need Dreams is always
to the
right.
1931 book, Astrology for Everyone. And I was researching this recently, and I read the introduction.
Oh, brother, what's up, man?
It'd been years since I read it, and I was blown away by what a baller move it was when she made this prediction in the introduction to this book, because the way that she does it is just absolutely stunning. So I'm going to read part of that because it's so impressive, and you can kind of get a sense for what I'm talking about. So at the beginning of the book, she has an introduction, and this is very much like a general introduction to astrology book. So she spends the majority of the introduction talking about some pretty basic things.
It's apparently
she says this book
people are happy there. Apparently the quality of life is good. It's also right in the middle of the country, which is going to be amazing for me for traveling.
And then eventually she has this whole long section.
There's a place
talking about
which is pretty nearby.
Date ranges basically for the different
it's
sun
called,
signs. So
I think that's the name.
Says, if you were born between May 22nd
seen
and
touristic,
Gemini,
eroded.
Gemini is the third
What's it
sign
called?
of the zodiac and is symbolized by the twins.
I forget what the karst. Karst formation.
Sometimes dilettantes often flirt.
Geology. K-A-R-S-T. So there's a lot of erosions, lots of really beautiful place, like Avatar style.
Introducing all these basic concepts.
Holy shit.
Eventually she gets to
oh my god, man. You okay, brother?
The introduction is at least a dozen pages long. Maybe twice.
Dude, check for tick bites, honestly.
How the planets move through the signs of the zodiac and how
wow,
you could,
I'm sorry, buddy.
Conceptualize them the hands
check for tick bites on your body. No, for real, dude.
And then she's talking about
you okay? Thank God. Are you sweating? Any fever? I'm sorry to hear that, man. Are you on any medication? Are you on any antidepressants or anything?
When she starts
SSRIs?
the end of
serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors?
Book on astrology, this basic book on astrology, and she writes it really well because she's writing this towards the end of her life. She's a lifelong astrologer and teacher of astrology, but also a good public communicator because she was really somebody who took advantage of radio and had a radio show about astrology.
Sounds like a blood pressure thing.
Communicating complex concepts in really simple language. So that's one of the things that really strikes you about
she have road rage
to this book. So she's talking about the movement of the planets through the signs.
A motorcycle.
And then she says, in this chapter, I do not need to describe each of the planets and its effect on mankind. These descriptions are given in the next several pages. But I think she means chapters, but I do not wish to leave this subject at this point without giving you one universally known
motorbikes,
example, which will, I hope, clarify the whole problem. That example is the horoscope
so fucking
of the
dangerous.
United States. She says, certainly nations have horoscopes, just as people do. France was born on such and such a date, Italy on another, Germany on still another, and our own country, as every American knows, on the 4th of July, 1776. All an astrologer needs to know to draw a horoscope of anybody or anything is this information about their birthday. It is better, of course, if she also knows the place and the hour, and in these matters too, it's possible to achieve scientific accuracy so far as the United States is concerned. For it's generally accepted, and properly so I believe, that the life of the American nation dates from that moment in Philadelphia at 3:03 in the morning, when the signers of the Declaration of Independence reached a positive decision to declare to the world their independence.
Look up a little more.
So, Evangeline Adams uses what's called the Gemini rising chart for the United States, which is almost the exact opposite time as the Sibley chart, because the Sibley chart is during the day, like later in the afternoon or evening, whereas the Gemini rising chart is curious because it's at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So this is where some of the debates about like the birth chart of the United States come in, and different astrologers have different opinions. But Luke Broughton, I think he used the Sibley chart, but he repeatedly said that Gemini was one of the main signatures for the United States. So I should confirm that, because he was certainly emphasizing the sign of Gemini and could see that it was super important for the United States. Evangeline Adams thought it was important, not just because of the Mars-Uranus conjunction, but also because she thought that Gemini was rising in the birth chart of the U.S. So she continues about the U.S. chart. The sun was in Cancer when the United States was born, but Gemini, the third sign of the zodiac, was rising, as we astrologers say, at that moment of birth, and is therefore most influential in determining our destiny. Gemini is itself a very nervous, restless, versatile, and highly mental sign. The fact that the United States was born so strongly under its influence would be enough, according to astrology, to account for much which is significant in American character and history. But that is not all. The ruling planet of the sign Gemini is Mercury, the messenger of the gods, which governs the mind, the imagination, and the nerves. This combination of celestial influences explains why we are the world's greatest travelers, greatest advertisers, greatest salesmen, and why incidentally we're so subject to the American disease of nerves, quote unquote. Several important and influential planets were in the ascendant at the time this child among nations was born. Among them, Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. Mars is not only the god of war, but it is the planet which gives ambition, initiative, courage, and aggressiveness. It is not difficult.
Man, I need to do a weightlifting stream really badly. I should have done it today, this afternoon, but I really wanted to play this.
Venus, although
I could feel it in my body.
Love, performs many other
I need to lift weights.
In the astrological scheme of things. She governs musicians, painters, actors, and artists in general, and surely no modern nation has done more than America to encourage and reward these professions. She also governs makers of toilet accessories, clothing manufacturers, and dealers in articles of adornment, all of them activities in which America attained front rank. Jupiter, the third of this heavenly trio, is the most powerful and the most American because it gives honor, glory, wealth, and the most sought-after thing in America, success. So she's delineating all these planets because in the Gemini rising chart, using quadrant houses, Gemini and the Cancer planet all fall in the first house, basically. Okay, so now, finally, she gets to the very last paragraph of the introduction, and listen to this. It says, Uranus, the planet which discards worn-out customs and forms of government, which breaks bonds and often causes estrangements, was also rising when our country was born, making July 4th, 1776 the predestined moment for us to shake off the yoke of monarchy and to set up in the New World a new form of government. Uranus has also had a marked effect on our later national life, for it is the planet which rules inventions in general and electrical inventions in particular, fields in which American genius has set a new pace for the world. But not all of Uranus's influence is good. It is, as I have already said, the heavenly planet which stirs revolutions and rebellion. and it is a fair assumption that whenever it completes its journey through the 12 signs and returns to the sign Gemini, ruling the United States, a cycle which takes 84 years, we may expect trouble of some sort.
Alright, I'm gonna reload the
Uranus was
vape
in
and put
Gemini
my
in
laundry in the dryer. Be right back.
1776, and we rebelled against England. Exactly 84 years later, in 1860, Uranus was in Gemini again, and we had a war between the North and the South. In 1942, Uranus again enters the sign Gemini. But I've said enough at this point to show you how the planets affect both character and destiny and their never-ending progression through the signs. And then it's a mic drop moment. She ends the introduction, and that's it. She was writing this in 1931, and she predicted when World War II would happen, when the US would enter into World War II, which then happened like 10 or 11 years after she published the book. And then she died the year after she published this. She died in 1932, so she didn't even live to see if her prediction would come true, but it very much did, because basically the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and then immediately the US gets involved in World War II shortly after that, especially in 1942. So that is a baller move that she actually wrote that in the introduction, and I'm so impressed. And so, yeah, it's a really cool piece of astrological history, just to give you some idea of how long astrologers have been using this cycle to not just study history, but also to make predictions. So super, super cool prediction on her part. And even the use of the M dash is actually pretty funny in the writing. All right, so that sets up, the last time that we experienced this was World War II, and it set up a precedent that was just impossible to ignore. And by implication, by the time you get to the late 20th century and the early 21st century, I knew about this repetition, and I think most astrologers, certainly anybody that did mundane astrology or worked with the birth chart of the United States or other things like that, knew about this repetition, and naturally it led one to wonder what would happen the next time Uranus would go into Gemini, starting in 2025 and going until 2033. So my friend Nick Diggin Best and I, this is such a key topic that it was one of the topics that I covered in one of my first episodes of the Astrology Podcast, which was episode 11 of the Astrology Podcast, titled The Astrology of Uranus and the United States, which was released on September 16th, 2013. And this was an episode where I was interviewing my friend Nick Diggin Best about a new book that he had just published called Uranus USA, where he went back and studied this repeating pattern of the US being involved in major wars every time Uranus was in Gemini. And he demonstrated, how closely the pattern held up, how well it held up, as well as some of the birth charts of different people involved, and how Uranus was hitting their birth charts in interesting and important ways in terms of some of the different people that were involved at crucial points, like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or other figures like that, because often Uranus would be prominent in the charts of some of these people who were pivotal during the wars. So I want to play a little bit of a clip from that, because in that clip, in the episode, it basically culminates after Nick and I talk about the historical recurrence of this transit in the three biggest wars in US history. It's sort of naturally, at the end, we end on Nick basically making a prediction and the inference being that a major war would begin after Uranus moves into Gemini in 2025, sometime during the course of this transit. So I'm going to play a clip from that episode now so you can listen to that discussion from 2013. And since this is so long ago, early in the history of the Astrology Podcast, I was only doing audio versions of the episodes and I wasn't doing video. So I decided to pick out a humorously old picture of me and Nick to go along with some visuals from that time frame, although the picture is a little bit older than 2013.
Sure, and yet despite that, because of some of the clear patterns that you've discovered, and because of the similarity of some of the repetitions in terms of the events that tend to coincide with them, that does still seem to lead you inevitably to drawing some conclusions about the future when similar alignments or planetary transits will occur. For example, one that obviously comes up many times in your book is Uranus in Gemini, and I think it's been on a lot of people's minds for a while now that we're due for another Uranus return in the United States chart, and Uranus is not too far from going back into Gemini in just a few years now.
12 years from now, yeah. It'll be entering Gemini in 2025.
Okay.
I'll say that, I mean, having just talked about how I'm safe and talking.
Hey everyone, this is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. Today I'm going to give you a look at a webinar that I did almost a year ago now on Uranus's entrance into the sign of Gemini. I did this a long time ago as a way of previewing what this major outer planetary shift would look like, and here we are today, July 7th of 2025, and Uranus is finally entering Gemini. I know that a lot of you have attended or have been interested in my monthly webinars, and this is also an opportunity for me to just show you and show the audience who watches this channel regularly what one of my monthly webinars look like. So I hope that you will enjoy this kind of reshare of a monthly webinar that I did, again, almost a year ago now, on Uranus's entrance into the sign of Gemini. Before we get into that, as always, remember to like and subscribe. It's my hope that today's talk, all of the talks we do on this channel, are like a form of spiritual practice. And if that's the case for you and you're here regularly, your like and subscribe go a long way to helping us grow and sustain ourselves. You can find transcripts of any of these daily talks on the website, of course, which is nightlightastrology.com. When you are over there, speaking of monthly webinars, I want to share with you the upcoming webinar that I am doing on the 9th house this Thursday night. So if you go over to live events, click on events, live talks, scroll down, you'll see this Thursday night. If you like this webinar that I'm replaying for you today, then consider coming out and learning about the 9th house Thursday night. We're going to talk about why Indian astrologers believe that this house contains some of our best karma. Why is that the case? And also, how can you work with and understand your own 9th house better? This will be a talk that I think a lot of you will really enjoy. If you can't make it live for this talk, you get the link to the webinar when you register, but if you can't attend live, we'll give you the replay link later so that you can watch or listen on your own time. And that's the case for all of our talks. The rest of the talks for the entirety of the year are now listed, so you can check those out and register for any of them that you like. Hope to see you there. So I thought, what better way to celebrate Uranus entering Gemini than give you a nice long really in-depth, deeply researched presentation that I did on the subject. I hope you will enjoy it. And also, this gives you a feel for what my monthly webinars are like. You're going to get some of the deeper, more substantive conference-style talks. Any of these talks are talks that I could easily bring and give at conferences. So the level of research and professionalism that goes into designing them and making them is several steps above, like daily YouTube content, and is really meant for, let's say, not total beginners, more like, intermediate level or even advanced. But I think, especially when it comes to the exploration of the outer planets moving signs, I did one with Neptune and Aquarius, or Pluto in Aquarius, Neptune in Aries, Saturn in Aries. This one, Uranus in Gemini. Again, I hope that you will enjoy it. And we will I'll be doing a Planets in Profile episode on Venus in Gemini as well tomorrow. Remember, interesting today to start the week that Venus is also trining Pluto. So it's a big start to the week. Uranus entering Gemini is definitely the headline though, so I hope you'll enjoy this. Okay. Well, I'm very excited to be here and to have a chance to look at what is arguably one of the biggest transits of next year in Uranus's ingress into the sign of Gemini. I'm going to put a presentation up on the screen. I believe this will probably take me maybe around an hour, although when it's my first time giving a presentation, I'm never sure how long it's going to take, 60 to 90 minutes, somewhere in there. After that, we'll open up for Q&A, and I'll just go until it feels like we've reached a nice spot for the evening, and we'll end it there. So, Uranus's entrance into Gemini, I've titled this talk Chaos, Mind, and Magic.
Likely not half hour mainly.
Because I think that these are some of the most exciting qualities of Uranus in
Probably
Gemini
just not a half hour.
on an archetypal level that we're going to see and that we can look forward to. And I'll say more about that as we get on with things here. But the purpose of the talk, very clear and simple. Let's take a look at the symbolism, archetypal symbolism of Uranus in Gemini prior to Uranus entering Gemini next year. Uranus will enter Gemini for the first time a year from right now in July of 2025, and it will not finish its stay in Gemini until May of 2033. Because of a little bit of retrograding back into Taurus that will happen between 2025 and 6, it looks like Uranus is going to spend 8 years in Gemini, but it actually spends only about 7. In my opinion, if we prepare ourselves, especially for slower moving transits, whether it's, to me, it's sort of like Jupiter through Pluto. Jupiter's going to spend a year in a sign. We ought to spend some time really reflecting on what that might be like to have a planet in a sign for an entire year. So I think we should do the same thing for the outer planets, and I am very excited to be thinking about Uranus in Gemini after almost 7 long years of Uranus in Taurus. I also believe that by prepping ourselves on both personal and collective levels of symbolism, the hope is that we're better prepared to engage with Uranus's next long transit rather than being grabbed by it. You guys know I like to use the word grab on my YouTube channel in a series we do where we share stories from people. The reason that we use that is the word grab comes from the word planet in the Indian tradition, which is called graha, which means grabber. And in that tradition, the planets can grab us unconsciously as the gods do. And we can also, by reflecting on the presence of the gods and being able to track them and read their signs and omens, we can also reflect upon their meaning in our lives and come to grasp what they're teaching us or what they're showing us. So the dual meaning of the word graha, to be grabbed by or to grasp something, is a really beautiful part of the Indian tradition. And for that same reason, we have this opportunity to look at a transit so that we are not merely grabbed by it. I mean, we're all going to be grabbed by it, right? That's part of the process, is making unconscious material conscious to us. And that it's like the big reveal. What will be in the treasure chest? We don't know. But on the level of when we're doing this, what we're doing is we're reflecting upon and entering into the sanctuary of the God. And by doing that with reverence and curiosity, I think that the God's interactions with us are much more personal. And there's nothing more terrifying than living in an objectified universe. A personal universe that speaks personally. It's much more inviting. It's more comfortable. So by doing this, we're also making sure that we're starting to take our sandals off outside of the next temple. Now, along the way tonight, it's my intention to also help students of astrology learn how delineations are put together piece by piece. I like to not just tell you, but I like to show you. So let me show you how this delineation is built so that you can take that material and use it to build your own delineations, as well as actually giving you delineations. So how the delineation is built. When any planetary delineation by sign alone, we're not using houses or house rulerships because we're not placing Uranus in Gemini into any particular chart in this presentation. We'll look at some charts in particular, but like when we're unpacking the archetypal meaning of a planet in a sign, we are doing that as a way of qualifying the archetypal meaning of the planet.
Cool, bro.
And the way it expresses
No worries,
itself
brother.
by virtue of being in a particular sign. We're not really taking into
Thanks for being here, man.
consideration what house it might be in, which would further modify. We have to do this because, otherwise we'd be here for days. So we want to start by considering the nature of the planet itself when building a delineation by sign. So Uranus and Gemini start with Uranus. What does Uranus mean? Then, after we've done that, we think about Uranus expressing itself through the archetypal lens of the planet or planets that rule the sign it occupies. With Gemini, that means Mercury. If it was Taurus, it would be both Venus and the Moon because they're joint rulers, Moon by exaltation, Venus by rulership. When it's Gemini, we just have one ruler, which is Mercury. So when we think about Uranus expressing itself through the archetypal lens of Gemini, we think about it expressing itself in a mercurial manner. The temple is likened unto the god and the god unto the temple for ancient astrologers, which means that Uranus in Gemini will be a mercurial kind of Uranus. That's really interesting because some modern or New Age astrologers have sometimes said that Mercury is, or that Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. Whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter to me personally, but I do think that there's a kind of interesting affinity between the two planets that we'll talk about more as we go. So finally, we then consider the basic sign features of Gemini as additional symbolic modifiers. So for example, Gemini is considered to be a masculine, or you could also call it yang, because we're talking about a metaphysical property, not a gender. Gemini is yang or masculine, double-bodied. It is an air of the air element. It comes at the end of the spring as the light is reaching its apex and will turn the corner and darkness will start to return. So called a double-bodied sign because it's of two natures simultaneously. It sits with a solid sign behind it and a tropical sign in front of it. And so it participates in a transitional state within the story of the light and dark patterning of the solar year. Then we create a synthesis of themes, both personal and collective, both light and dark. So we put it all together and we then look at the spectrum of different themes that come from it. And some of those we will describe or experience, especially in our relative human terms, the language of pleasure and pain, what we like and don't like. We will also find that there are a spectrum of expressions that the planet has that we might also consider morally good or bad. But they're all divine in some transcendental archetypal sense. Anyhow, let's begin. So let's first look at the archetypal Uranus. I use the Cosmos and Psyche for descriptions of the planets in a lot of my series because it's good to refresh, especially since this is a mixed audience. So Richard Tarnas describes Uranus in the following way in his book. Uranus is empirically associated with the principle of change, rebellion, freedom, liberation, reform and revolution, and the unexpected breakup of structures. With sudden surprises, revelations, and awakenings, lightning-like flashes of insight, the acceleration of thoughts and events, with births and new beginnings of all kinds, and with intellectual brilliance, cultural innovation, technological invention, experiment, creativity, and originality. In addition to the occurrence of sudden breakthroughs and liberating events, Uranus transits are linked to unpredictable and disruptive changes. Hence, the planet is often referred to as the cosmic trickster. Another set of themes associated with Uranus is a concern with the celestial and the cosmic, with astronomy and astrology, with science and esoteric knowledge, and with space travel and aviation. With respect to personal character, Uranus is regarded as signifying the rebel and the innovator, the awakener, the individualist, the dissident, the eccentric, the restless, and wayward. You put it in a nutshell, Uranus is the principle of change with respect to the status quo. Like wherever there's a status quo, eventually it reaches a point where, well, structures can change in many different ways, first of all, but often structures will reach a breaking point where they are overthrown suddenly, swiftly, where new ideas strike people and sudden innovation or original thinking comes and often revolutionizes and replaces old systems or structures or traditions. Revolution can happen within a tradition, revolution can smash a tradition. There's so many different ways it can take place, but this really is the planet linked to revolution. Revolution can happen spiritually, it can happen psychologically, it can happen in relationships, it can happen in sexuality, it can happen in education, it can happen in science. You know, revelation, awakening, liberation, sudden liberating events. Uranus is also linked to those moments where suddenly you were stuck and now, boom, you're unstuck. Maybe that unstuckness also comes at the cost of some things being broken. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Uranus transit people's ascendant or their 7th house, and their relationship completely breaks apart suddenly and unexpectedly, but it is the most liberating event of their life because it was time to move on. I wish that wasn't the case, but like that happens. Uranus enters people's 10th houses and suddenly they quit or lose their job. Or suddenly they decide to go back to school for something totally different and way in left field compared to where they've been. Uranus is something as kinky and weird and fun as like the Rocky Horror Picture Show and a tattoo on your butt cheek that you get randomly one night. And it is also as original and inventive as the development of the Hubble Space Telescope. So I love this planet. I love it. I've had it on my ascendant the past couple of weeks. I feel like I'm plugged into like a cosmic circuitry. I just am like zzz. Hit my health a little bit hard at first. Has created some amazing breakthroughs and awakening. Has also been turbulent. But it's so interesting. Like, so I've been into astrology for 14 years, whole time. So I've lived consciously as an astrologer through Uranus in Aries and now Uranus in Taurus. That's what I've experienced from within the astrological period of my life. So interesting to see the differences politically, collectively, historically, and personally by house and sign. I'm really excited about Uranus into Gemini. So, let's talk about Mercury next, because remember, Uranus in Gemini is going to be in the temple of Mercury. Because it will be taking place, this transit, in one of the temples of Hermes Mercury, it's important that we refresh on the archetypal symbolism of Mercury. So, Richard Tarnas, take us there. He says, the principle of mind, thought, communication, that which articulates the primary creative energy and renders it intelligible. The impulse and capacity to think, to conceptualize, to connect and mediate, to use words and language, to give and receive information. To make sense of, to grasp, to perceive, to reason, understand and articulate, to transport, translate and transmit. The principle of logos. Now for the ancients, logos, we get the word logic from, but the logos was like, well, think about the word astrology, astrologia, which would mean something, I know my Greek probably sucks, but it means the study or the science or the reasoning or the intelligence, all different translations of the word logos, of the stars, of the sky. So Hermes is associated with philosophy. Philosophy itself also has the sense of being connected to the history of what is true. Like logos is sort of like, another word for it literally is word. Like in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and I'm gonna mess that up. Let me actually pull the quote so I can read it because it's a good one. Let's just see here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that, and I remember when I was in college, I studied philosophy, and I had a professor who spoke at length in a lecture that he gave on the influence that Greek philosophy had on the writing of this particular gospel and the way that the word logos is being used in the Greek, of the Greek language in the New Testament here. That word logos is really important for the understanding of Uranus and Gemini, because one of the gods associated with Uranus is not really, like Uranus, like the ancient Greek god, is really not the best match for the planet Uranus. It's Prometheus is actually the mythological character that most modern archetypal astrologers associate with Uranus. And that Prometheus is a light bringer. You know, he brings the fire from the gods to people to liberate them and to give them understanding and knowledge of logos, of like divine knowledge. And Hermes is very similar to Prometheus because he is the messenger of the gods, and he is the patron saint, you might say. Or he's a patron and a matron. He's genderless. Hermes is more of a they, you know. But Hermes is the progenitor of astrology itself. Because astrology was considered to be a divine language of the gods, of reality. That's logos, that's real logos. Not just how does shit work mechanically. You know, like that's interesting, and there's a lot of things we can do with that. But the difference between using knowledge and information about reality to build empires, to, you know, promote the agenda of colonialism and our rise of hierarchies of wealth and power, and the use of knowledge in that particular way is considered a dark or shadow side of Hermes, and how human beings participate in that archetypal field. Just like Mars could be courage, or you could see Mars being used for selfish violence. So Hermes is also about whether knowledge is being used for understanding divinity and being closer to divinity and improving our lives insofar as we become a more spiritual people or if information is being used to promote egotistical, selfish, greedy, materialistic ambitions. This makes Uranus's trip through Gemini very intriguing. And that connection between Hermes and Prometheus is profound because Prometheus steals the fire from the gods and is also punished for his crime. He's tortured endlessly until Chiron comes and takes his place in one of the stories. But the point being that there is always something potentially transgressive and very complicated about our approach to understanding higher truth. When we get, the closer we get to higher truth, the greater the temptations become to use those truths to power. The word, the etymology of the word power has everything to do with the history of patriarchy and colonialism. The word etymologically is related to possession, to power over other people, to victory and conquest in this military sense of it, to being stronger than other people, to having dominion over others. That's the history of the word power. Whenever knowledge is used for power, it becomes a real shadow. And there's always a temptation for it to go in that direction, which is why the ancients had stories about Hermes as someone that it was like in the sign of Gemini. You have a light and a dark side to everything, even knowledge, wisdom. What do you do with it? Okay.
I just want to add a quote.
The Temple of the Twins in Gemini. We have Jupiter in Gemini aiding us tonight. Right? It's like we're calling upon you, Jupiter in Gemini, to help us understand. Gemini is a double-bodied sign, which means that it constitutes one of the four liminal or transitional spaces between light and darkness that occur in the solar year. Now, the zodiac's foundational logic comes from an understanding of the great cycle of light and darkness that constitute the solar year, in case you don't know that. At the outset of Gemini, which takes place in the last 30 days of spring, just prior to the summer solstice, the sun is moving upward toward its highest arc in the sky, which gives us the longest day of the year from the northern hemisphere standpoint. Remember, all of this is symbolic and archetypal. Don't take it literally. You don't have to flip hemispheres for astrology to work. From this symbolic standpoint of this great circle of light and dark, as oriented originally from the northern hemisphere, at this time of year, the sun is moving
thanks,
up towards its
Jernsey.
apex.
How are you?
And what
How are you? I
happens
never
is,
left
as
you.
it is doing so,
I've been here the whole time.
the momentum
Except
of
Jernsey
the
vibes.
arc of the sun starts to shift and turn
How are you?
toward sinking. It's really interesting. I have an astronomy program that I use sometimes called Starry Night Pro.
You're doing well.
And in that program, if you actually, day by day, if you watch the ascension of the
Jernsey.
the ecliptic, which is the sun's path, but it's also the defining line of the zodiac. If you watch that line lift through the last 30 days of spring, which is Gemini season, you'll see that as it's lifting, it's like sort of tilting and turning and getting ready to start sinking back down. So the way I would describe it astronomically is that it's like watching a car starting to lean into a big turn that will take it going in the opposite direction, like a big U-turn. And Gemini constitutes the sun starting to ease into that turn. And then by the very end of Gemini,
Why does he always kneel,
it is now
man? Like,
fully going in the
why?
opposite direction.
Why does
So
he kneel,
Gemini
Jernsey?
constitutes for ancient astrologers the
How are you?
transition
Doing
between
great.
the rising of the light and then Gemini, the turning back to darkness. From the summer solstice forward, the light starts to decline every single day. So think about Gemini as, zodiacally speaking, as the shift from the rising of the light to the sinking of the light within
Cool.
the light half of the solar year. From Aries all the way through Virgo, we're on the light half of the year. Libra to Pisces, dark half of the year. On the light half of the year, Gemini constitutes the end of the rising of light and the beginning of the setting of the light within the light half. This intricacy between light half, dark half, and then the phases of light within the light half and the phases of dark within the dark half is also fundamental to the entire conceptualization of the I Ching in ancient China. So it's really beautiful how so many different mystical schools looked at that movement for metaphysical, philosophical, spiritual wisdom. This handing over from light into dark, rising into setting, is fundamentally tied to the meaning of Gemini and the reason why ancient astrologers placed Hermes, Mercury, there as the ruler. Now, the reason for that is that Mercury, as a planet, resembles this turning point. Because what does Mercury do more regularly than any other planet? It rises up, and then it turns and sinks. And it does it more quickly than any other planet. It rises up to its maximal longevity, eastern or western elongation, and then it turns and it descends back into the darkness, into the underworld, and then it rises up again. So Hermes is not only the ruler of Gemini, but also of Virgo for similar reason. Virgo takes us from the light half of the year into the dark half of the year. Whereas in Gemini, we have Gemini taking us from the rising of light within the light half of the year to the return of darkness within the light half of the year. Both signs, though, are about a place where you're moving from light toward dark, but in different ways. In both of those places, Hermes is the ruler. Again, the reason for that is that Hermes is the planet that most frequently descends back into darkness, into the underworld. Hermes was called the psychopomp, the god of souls, and Hermes mythology is connected intimately with the descent and reemergence into Hades and back out. Now, so we have this beautiful connection between Hermes, Mercury, and the double-bodied temple of Gemini. Gemini is also assigned the nature of air and mind, along with the rulership of Hermes Mercury, due to the deconstructive nature of the mind.
I don't know if
as
that
well as the
worked.
fact that the mind
I don't
operates
know if it was
duality
convincing.
and opposites like a binary code language. So let me unpack that a little bit. The element of air may have been grafted onto all of the elements may have been grafted onto the early system of the zodiac a little bit later. It may not have been original, in other words. But regardless, it comes to be very quickly associated, Gemini does, with the element of air. And the air element is related to the mind. And Hermes Mercury is obviously a planet that's intimately related to the mind and mental power or energy in general. There's a way in which Hermes is also associated with Earth and Virgo that's very interesting. We'll have more time to talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about that another time, the mind, the analytical mind, the mind of Hermes, is thought of as a deconstructive analytical mind. It's the mind that takes things apart in order to put them back together. Or, natural opposite, by the way, both of Hermes' rulerships in Gemini and Virgo are opposite the rulerships of Jupiter in Sagittarius and Pisces. And so there's also a natural way in which Jupiter represented cohesion and unity, and Hermes Mercury represented deconstruction and taking things apart. The natural quality of darkness in the ancient imagination, metaphysically, philosophically, was associated with deconstruction. When darkness comes in, everything falls apart. And think about that from the standpoint of age. As you age, the lightness and brightness in your eyes and your body starts dimming, and you start falling apart, you start decaying. The light of fire goes down right in the evening, and death comes in, right? You gotta be careful during the night. this kind of thinking was just one of many, many, many different ways that ancient people had of thinking about darkness or yin or the feminine. It meant so many different things, some of them very beautiful and elevated, others like very primal and dark. And the same thing for yang or light. But Hermes rules two signs wherein darkness is rising or darkness is taking over. The darkness starts to rise again within the solar year once we hit Cancer, and darkness takes over in Libra right after Virgo. So those signs of Mercury are also about deconstruction in the sense that darkness is the natural way in which something singular becomes variegated, or something whole is broken down into its parts. Which is why, for the same exact reason, Cancer was called, coming right after Gemini, was called the gateway of mankind, where the one descends and disseminates into the many. The one is deconstructed, and rather than being one and whole, it is now many. And in a mysterious way, it's still whole. But that's Mercury, Hermes, to take things apart, to make them variegated. It's a very fascinating thing about astrology, which Hermes rules, by the way. Just a reminder. Interesting thing about astrology is that if you want to understand houses, you have to understand planets. Because you can't possibly understand the 12th house from the ancient standpoint until you really understand Saturn. Can't understand the 6th without Mars.
Please.
But then there's this really crazy way, and you can't understand what a square is without understanding what Mars is. You know, you can't understand what a trine is without understanding what Jupiter is. Can't understand what dignities are without understanding the sun and the moon. Every little pocket of theory in ancient astrology it has to be studied in a way like as a fragment, but then the more you study, the more you realize that you have to study this thing over here to understand another part over here. This is very Hermes-like in the sense that Hermes is like a mandala. Everything is connected in the mandala, but everything also has its own individual little space. And Hermes is very much about moving from seeing the mandala as just one thing to seeing it as many different things aggregated together. So there's this deconstructive tendency with the mind that is very much like Hermes, that is very much like air, that is very much like the return of darkness happening at this time of year. The gateway of mankind in Cancer, the very next sign where the darkness starts returning, is literally depicted as the descent of the one into the many, the spirit into the form, or forms, plural, or the Ade, the archetypes, the gods, becoming manifest in things like livers and kidneys and all the constituent parts of a human being.
I tried to do the late A, boys.
Gemini is
I tried to do the late A and Jaws effed me up.
A process of incoming darkness and deconstruction through the mind.
Jaws fucking was like, no way. Jaws was on me, bros. I tried the late A. What up, Scotty? I built the pyramid. Yo, thanks, brother.
Called the Temple of Hermes Mercury because Mercury is also a planet who constantly descends into the underworld, deconstructing and eventually reconstructing or emerging again, just as the sun begins its annual descent around.
It's a huge idea. Come on.
Gemini, like Hermes, is thus a place of intellectual curiosity.
Bro, Jaws was on my ass. Holy fuck.
Communication, mental stimulation,
there's nothing you can do.
The
Jaws is gonna fuck you up.
Really
like.
Fascinating is that at a transitional space between light and dark, you also have a sign in Hermes that is very good at playing with the light and the dark, which, in other words, are any and all opposites.
Scott, hey, what's up, brother?
Thought of by ancient
I did build the pyramids
as
with my will. I willed them to formation.
Facilitating it. The reason that many different
the late A, no. I mean, dude, that was the only reason why I tried the late A was because the glass didn't open. But dude, I would need to have passed away.
Everything together is a language of binaries, opposites.
Oh no, I don't have the tape. I didn't have the tape.
Opposites
Never mind. I
themselves,
can't.
ancient
No,
astrologers had different ways of
I didn't have the
relating.
tape.
Two fundamental ways that opposites could relate.
My
They
mistake.
could
My
relate
apologies.
as dualities.
But even if I
Hard,
did,
opposed,
I didn't know that Jaws would be
black,
on you
white.
like that. Because I knew you have to like. I know you had to pass away that guard. I didn't know there was 2 guards. I passed away 2 guards.
There was a whole way.
Jaws was on my ass, man. I didn't let go of C up. I don't think even. He was just fucking there,
man. That is
man.
right. That is wrong. We all live with that kind of duality. And then there's this other way in which
Yeah, like
opposites
I didn't
exist,
like. He just
which
knew
is
I
that
was
they
gonna be
exist
there.
along a spectrum. You know, that they move fluidly, and that they're not just static categories, but that they're moving, living categories that move in and out of each other all the time. Hermes is thought of as fluid.
What's up, Scotty? I hope you're good, man.
Because Hermes doesn't recognize gender, for example, metaphysically, but because Hermes both recognizes and doesn't recognize gender at the same time. Acknowledges opposites, works with them, and also plays with them fluidly as though they are real. So
I'm good, dude.
both
Thanks, man.
exist. Uranus and Gemini
Hope you're doing well.
must present through a combination of all of these qualities that we're mentioning here, but especially through the archetypal nature of Gemini's ruler, which is Hermes Mercury. Okay, so it's like scaffolding. We're building our way into an understanding of the light and dark side of Uranus and Gemini. So now I'm gonna lay it on you. So the first major category
Appreciate it, brother.
that I've been working with and developing is, and this is stuff, eventually you'll see little bits and pieces of this on my YouTube channel, I'm sure. The light and dark side of Uranus and Gemini. The first one is the theme of intellectual revolution and fanatical idealism. So Uranus and Gemini will blend the intellectual qualities of airy Mercurial Gemini with the revolutionary and innovative qualities of Uranus to produce breakthroughs in how we think, especially in the ideas that we hold to be most valuable or interesting or true, as well as learning and education itself. So it will not be surprising over the 7 years that we see Uranus and Gemini to see on a personal level, to see major breakthroughs in how we perceive, how we think, how we communicate. The ideas that capture our imagination will be truly revolutionary on a personal level. There will be so much learning and breakthroughs in how we think. And not just how we think, but also how we learn. What we learn with, what we use to learn, who we learn from, why we're learning what we're learning. These things will all go through significant changes. There will also be innovation that we'll see socially or collectively in education and institutions of higher learning, in how we think and learn, along with
don't tell AI any of your like secrets, because AI is a rat.
Culturally or historically. And also there'll be tremendous personal revolution.
It remembers and regurgitates. AI is like a parrot.
Lighting us up inside.
Treat AI
So, for example,
like
to
someone's
illustrate,
parrot.
in the 1940s, Jean Piaget, I think that's how you say his name, developed a series of new ideas about developmental learning in children. And he also became the director of the International Bureau of Education in 1941, a position that he held all the way until 1968. He is one of the, I mean, I'm not saying his ideas are all still relevant or valid today, right? When I look back historically, I'm certainly not suggesting that. But he was a revolutionary figure in the history of developmental learning and early childhood education. Some of his ideas are super dated, and we might even say backward, but at the time, this was an incredibly Uranus in Gemini like figure. Now, the reason that I mentioned the 1940s, I'm going to see if I can bring this up. A lot of tonight, I'm realizing I should make this more obvious. So give me Erica, will you tell me if you can see the chart on the screen?
Not yet. Now I can. Now I can't.
Can you see it?
You can see it.
Oh, wait. Okay. Oh, no. I'm struggling there, sorry. Okay, can you see the... I'm sorry, Erica, one more time. Can you see the chart?
Yes, you have Uranus in the 6th.
Yes, okay, perfect. So I want to take you guys back in time. You can see I'm just dragging Uranus backward. And almost all, I think all of the examples that I used for tonight's talk come from the last time that Uranus was in Gemini. So that last time that Uranus was in Gemini, right about here. This is August of 1941. And then if we keep going, it was ingressed again in May of 42. And then it spends in Gemini from about 41, 42, oops, let's go to years, all the way until about 1948. So a significant portion of the 1940s, like 41 to 48 roughly, but here if you go forward in 48, like you'll see that we get a retrograde into Gemini, and it doesn't technically leave into Cancer until 49. So like 41 to 49, all those years include some periods with Uranus in Gemini, and certainly 42 to 48 being like the sweet spot. So that is where I drew a lot of these examples from, and I think I may have failed to mention that in the slides, which I can't believe I did, but there we have it. So now you know, and those listening to the recording will now know why I'm talking about the 1940s. All right, let's put this. Okay. All right. Can you see the presentation again, Erica?
Yeah, it's a full screen though of your computer. There you go.
Okay. So, Jean Piaget. Or think, for example, of a few of the following revolutionary thinkers and artists who were born while Uranus was in Gemini between 41 and 48. I think this one's really fascinating. Dennis Ritchie, who was born in 1941 with Uranus in Gemini, at the 0-degree marker, by the way, which is where we'll see it next summer. He's the creator of the C programming language. And I'm sure anyone with any kind of computer background knows what that is or knows about that. An incredibly significant part of the language of programming that he developed. Here's someone developing a computer language that was born with Uranus and Gemini. Or let's go to the more avant-garde artistic side of things. Think about Brian Eno, who was born in 1948 with Uranus and Gemini, pioneer of ambient music and electronica. He is someone who revolutionized music in a sense by really doing a lot to incorporate technology and music. I mean, he's like a digital artist.
Have left the band. I'm sorry, brother.
That's really fascinating.
I'm really sorry to hear that, man.
Mercury and Neptune as well too. That really strikes me as
cool, dude. Yeah, I subscribed to your YouTube. I saw the single came out.
Now, on the other hand, as much as
maybe a month ago,
would produce ideas.
It was great, man. 6 songs.
With new ideas about music, ideas about
it
education,
sucks.
Development of,
I'm sorry, buddy.
Programming and computers that we just saw. Uranus and Gemini will also produce fanatical thinking and ideas or visions of progress. Because
sorry, I don't know.
Uranus,
can't remember.
all things,
I thought I saw
old paradigm to a new
some release about a month ago.
Futuristic and progressive as an archetypal field.
Maybe I'm just tripping. Maybe it was
Uranus
longer
and Gemini
ago.
can produce fanatical ideas and thinking or visions of progress that
January.
we're somewhat obsessed with.
Maybe it
There's
was a few months
always
ago.
that potential for transgression, for a transgressive use of
I'm probably
knowledge.
thinking January one.
Uranus and Gemini can suggest
Next
blind
one's Friday.
adherence to whatever is new or trending in the realm
Sick,
of thoughts
dude.
and ideas.
That's
or
great, man.
technology. Or
Oh,
it's like whatever we think is new, we think will help us without thinking about it enough.
then I saw. I must have been.
For example, in the 1940s,
Going through your channel.
we saw the peak of fascist regimes in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. These ideologies promoted ideas of racial superiority, nationalism, and progress at all costs, and were often supported by various pseudoscientific theories that were being developed at that time about race and genetics. So, that's the double-edged sword of Uranus and Gemini, is that we will also see people using science to bolster very aggressive and sort of but potentially delusional ideas of progress. This technology, this idea, this science can back or support some kind of agenda, and the agenda may actually be evil in the case of Nazi Germany or whatever. You see what I mean? Eugenics, which is a pseudoscience of improving the genetic quality of a human population through selective breeding and sterilization, became popular during the 1940s.
It's okay. Road bands change, right? I mean, you understand that. People understand that.
For racial segregation and genocide.
It's going to be valuable. Like, it is valuable. It's extremely valuable. I think you
Just
should promote it
because it's
still.
new, just because it's
Are you going
cutting
to
edge,
I should definitely promote it and be proud of it.
doesn't mean
Because if you think about
that
it,
it's
people
actual
change.
progress. Doesn't mean it's actually
The big
good
one
for
is
us.
drummers,
So
right?
new ideas, new thinking, that's not
Or
thoroughly
guitarists
tested, that is just
sometimes.
immediately utilized
Doesn't
without
mean the previous
forethought.
songs are
Is
shouldn't
also
be
a
like
huge
they're
part
still
of what
valued,
Uranus
especially with
and
you
Gemini is.
on the guitar.
More on that later. You'll see more examples that mirror that same idea. The next thing that
Which I argue, I think
focused on
the
was
guitar is.
the rebellious and revolutionary side of Uranus meeting with the ideological,
Can be the
intellectual
most
side
like
of
super legendary.
Gemini, where we
Just the
have
range of notes and sounds.
themes of rebelliousness in thought, belief, or ideology. Uranus and Gemini will tend to emphasize playful, experimental ideas, as well as rebellious and defiant and original thinking or beliefs that cut against the grain or that defy the status quo. Cool. I mean, as someone who's progressive and always curious about new
You can
things,
do what
and,
Jimmy Page.
I mean,
Sorry.
my life wouldn't be what it is.
I know
I'd
it's
get
a
interested in
serious
things
issue.
like consciousness and yoga and psychedelics as medicine, and I consider myself to be fairly open-minded. I've got Mars in Gemini.
I was gonna say you can do like Jimmy Page. You are in England.
So this is exciting.
Go to a fucking
This, to me,
karaoke
is,
bar.
like,
Find the
genuinely
next
exciting.
Robert Plant.
I would say
I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's actually like literally what happened, right?
Of unknowing or deconstruction
Or an
and
open mic.
uncertainty. Because Hermes is deconstructive and likes to call things into question, likes to debate, likes to
But I
take things
think
apart as opposed to put them
Page,
together.
Jimmy
Is
Page is the heart
skeptical
of
in
Led
some ways
Zeppelin.
by nature. That doesn't
Sorry,
mean that
Robert Plant, I
Mercury
love you, man, but
Hermes is not connected with true
I think Jimmy
gnosis,
Page
like
even
true
wrote
knowing.
most of the lyrics
But
too,
it does mean that there's
and songs.
a real gift with Hermes and Gemini to question things, to get to the like Socrates, who's interested in truth.
So you can be like the Jimmy
So you
Page,
get through a
brother.
lot of bullshit, along the way. So Uranus and Gemini is also about the revolution of unknowing, deconstruction.
And that might have been the stupidest conversation I had.
You have
I may have
this
sounded really ridiculous and naive,
avant-garde
but
sense of experimental, rebellious ideas, original thinking, beliefs that cut against the grain or defy the status quo on the one hand, and you also have this revolution.
You know who would
of
have an
unknowing
opinion on that?
deconstruction,
VFX.
uncertainty.
VFX would have an opinion on that
And
one.
these both play into that overall theme of revolution on the level of intellect and ideology. Well, when you see that present in art in the 1940s, think, for example, of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, that was released in 1941 as Uranus had just entered Gemini. Why is that significant? Because this is one of the most, at the time, and still is considered, one of the most experimental leaps in cinematography and film and cinema in general that had been taken to that point and still represents, I mean, just like there's been many great bands since the 1960s, but the 1960s was like this incredible moment for a revolution in music. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane is that for film. It goes ahead of its time, challenges the status quo. But then you also have Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, published in 1943 while Uranus was in Gemini, or Albert Camus' The Stranger, published in 1942 while Uranus was
Sorry,
in
man, I
Gemini.
gotta read all you
Both
wrote.
call into question this whole idea that there's meaning in things.
Submitted
You're
for
meaningful.
Spotify official
It
playlist
calls
because
into
the distributor
question,
didn't send it to
how much
stores
we're
in
projecting into the
time. Oh
universe,
wow, really? There's
the
a thing
idea
like that?
of it being meaningful.
Playlist for 3 store
Among other
release
things
and the
that
distributor
are
sent it 1 week.
a part of
What?
the entire movement of
That's whack.
existentialism, which is
That's whack,
exploding
bro.
while Uranus is in Gemini. Don't be surprised if we see a pretty deep
What?
level
Why?
of existential despair.
Why
but
are you
also
saying
excitement.
this so late?
Existentialism is not
Why?
new. It wasn't new in the
That's
40s.
absurd.
It's been
Distributor.
around, been called different things by different people for thousands
Who's
of
your
years.
distributor?
And at its heart, what does existentialism represent? You could say that it represents a fundamental way of coming into the present moment by stripping ourselves of the myth of meaning. It's like, just get rid of grand narratives. Get rid of, it's very, in a sense, existentialism is very close to some forms of Buddhism. But it's that like, stop telling big stories about reality. You know, come into the unknowing present. There's a lot of people who feel very enlivened by things like agnosticism or atheism, not because they're
This is
proudly,
normal?
they're
Wow.
proudly negating the bullshit of people who believe stuff, right? But because there's
Sorry,
something
brother.
very enlivening about this present moment without any great certainty clouding my ability to experience the present. Now, I'm not saying I'm personally
Ditto
not
music,
a super
bro.
existentialist or anything, right? But you'll be
How
surprised
can they send it a week
compelling
late? What are they even
an
doing?
existential way
Are
of
they even
thinking will
editing
become when Uranus is in Gemini.
the... That's
Also, think
insane.
about artists like Salvador Dali, who's a surrealist, or Jackson Pollock, who's called an abstract expressionist, whose works were also deeply influential during the 1940s. And what they did more than anything was just cut against the
Wow.
grain of the status quo in art, just like Citizen Kane and Orson Welles.
I'm sorry, bro. That's crazy.
Let's take
Sad to
things
hear.
apart and remake them in a way that is not the norm. Let's go against coherence and into
Jeez.
magic and chaos. That's Jackson Pollock in my words.
No. Oh.
Uranus and Gemini can also favor a kind of intellectual nihilism or tendency toward radical deconstruction, as just deconstruction also creates a sense of hopelessness. You got to be careful with that, because what we don't recognize is that even philosophies of unknowing or a refutation of meaning or grand narratives are things that we can become fanatical about. And so rejecting meaning, rejecting God, being a deconstructionist, whatever, can become so fanatical that people can't hold their own philosophy with the same lightness, and so they become hopeless. They're captured secretly by the same monotheism that they were captured by before, you know? I'm just speaking broadly. Born in the 1940s while Uranus was in Gemini, Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger. Does he not strike you as a great... I think it's interesting that he has...
Absurd.
Saturn
I'm sorry, brother.
present,
I really am.
but he just has that electric, mercurial vibe as an artist. Born with Uranus in Gemini. Definitely.
Sorry, man.
Okay, Randall.
So what, if you get premium?
We're feeling good.
So they said if you get premium, it'll fix that issue?
Looking at the big picture today of North America.
Pay for premium with Ditto or pay for premium with Spotify?
6, 7 episodes, I believe. And we've thrown a lot of, you can say, pins on the
How
map.
much is premium with Spotify? It can't be that
Now we're
much. It
gonna
must be
start
like
to draw
$10
the
or
lines and
something.
Connect them and maybe throw a couple more up there today and give people a full look at it.
I hear you from Ditto. I get it. That's extortion, bro. That's fucking extortion. That's what that is. It's extortion.
The lens that I look at it through is this. If we look at the entire time that humans have been on this earth, and it could be 180, 200,000 years now, modern humans, maybe longer, we don't know.
Spotify
And
being a store.
if we start looking at events,
They were sending to
global change
stores
events,
earlier.
there's probably nothing that equals, certainly not exceeds, the events that transpired between, let's say, 11 and 14 or 15,000 years ago.
Well, I hope you get it resolved, man. And don't worry about it. You know, everything happens for a
1,000 years
reason.
or so, roughly, give or take.
If it doesn't get
That just
promoted
seems to
now,
have
it's
been a
okay.
concentrated period
Because maybe
of
when you find your new
change
bassist
on
and
every
vocalist,
conceivable level.
they'll promote you when you're ready, you know what I mean? And then this single will become like an old school hit of your band. It's like I like listening to old Nirvana before the Foo Fighters guy, David Grohl's.
The effects of these gigantic megaforms
You know what I mean?
are being recognized and documented.
I mean, it's still like Kurt Cobain, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a totally different vocalist, but
Areas of research and study of our
that was a bad
present
example.
time. And what makes it even more doubly interesting to me,
Because you lose a
is number one,
vocalist.
these are events that happened within the time
Deezer?
modern humans have been on Earth. Let's see, let me get my calculator here. And if I go back, let's say to the Younger Dryas, I'm going to put in 12,900 years. I'm going to divide by 25 years, assuming that's roughly a generation. We're looking at about 500 generations.
You know what's crazy? Like,
If we
Ed
wanted to count our
Sheeran gets
ancestors back about 500
like
generations, we would be
hundreds
back
of
at the
millions
end
of
the Ice Age.
views
Our
on his
ancestors at
music.
that time were
He writes a lot of
cohabitating
music,
with these gigantic,
but it's just like so
extraordinary megafauna,
crazy.
the giant ground sloths, the mammoths, the mastodons, the dire wolves.
Is it
the
marketing?
giant
It must be
short-faced
marketing.
bear,
It has to be.
the huge
Ed
camels.
Sheeran is not
You know, the list goes on
like
and
the
on
next
and on.
fucking like
All those
Mozart.
guys that are gone,
I mean,
well,
I'm not hating on Ed Sheeran, but
we
like, you know what I
talk
mean?
about
It's gotta be
the
marketing.
megafauna.
He does have nice songs,
How
but
do you talk about the megafauna
and I guess
without
the songs, if you can play it anywhere, people's weddings.
Where did they go?
Well, so how do you answer that? Well, one way to start
You get the
answering
female
it
fan
is
base, which is like
you start
50% of
looking
the
at
population.
The fossilized remains of these animals and the circumstances in which we find those animals. Now, there is a sub, I would say a sub.
It's like, how do you get onto that marketing train? You know what I mean?
Or sub-branch
Life is all about marketing.
paleontology called taphonomy. Go ahead and look it up for us, and let's get the scientific definitions. TAPH. ONOMY, taphonomy. And basically what it's going to tell us is that it's the processes that occur to an animal when between its death and its interment into the fossil record.
Yeah, the scientific study of what happens to remains of organisms from the time of death to the time of discovery, particularly focusing on decay, preservation, and fossilization.
Yes. So, what are the circumstances in which the megafauna remains are found?
No way, dude. TikTok's retarded. TikTok is the fucking stupidest shit.
In northern climates, you find the remains in permafrost.
TikTok is so stupid,
Lower
man.
latitudes,
I fucking
find
hate
them
it.
in peat bogs,
And YouTube Shorts, I fucking hate YouTube
and most
Shorts.
prevalently in
I despise
gravel
YouTube Shorts.
Well, gravel
It's really sad because there's a lot of great content like YouTube Shorts. Like I think like Irie's GoldenEye rundowns are YouTube Shorts, but I mean like
if you have a low-lying area,
same.
and it's choked
It's just like why don't
particularly
it's such
organic
shitty
material,
quality.
and it washes in and
Just the
settles
video
into a
quality. I mean, not the
low-lying
content.
area. Later on, when it
You
does
know, you gotta
fall,
like.
it
It's
will
just.
fall, right. There's a lot of plant and organic material in a peat bog.
It's crazy.
And then
I'm not hating. I'm not hating anyone. I'm just saying.
gravel is almost
I haven't liked
exclusively
shorts since
byproduct
the day one though.
of water deposition,
This is a channel I like
sedimentation, gravel, sand, silt, right? Well,
on
over
YouTube, and they moved their like main
findings
weekly
of some bones from a
show
man or
to
tissue
like
or
a
whatever.
short. Used to be a 15-minute fucking
More
video,
often than not, it's going to be found
and now it became a fucking 30-second short.
in gravel beds and quarries.
It's terrible.
Over and over again. There's a quarry there's an excavation.
But that's not like this.
And
That's not.
the animals found
You're right. Yeah, it's just like
entombed
producing.
within very peatified soil or gravel or sand, etc. So,
But I mean, it's
in
yeah.
other words, the majority
Because you have good music, you know what I mean? As a musician, you want to promote. I'm not talking about for me, right? I'm just saying if I was a musician trying to
So
get my music out there.
about the mystery of the disappearance of the great mammalian megafauna
Distributor.
without addressing the context in which their remains are now preserved for us to find. And in virtually 90% of the cases,
Crazy.
they're found in deposits, flood deposits, because I'll cite an example of something that I think sheds insight into this process. In the 1980s, at the turn of the 20th century, I think the estimates were there was about 20 million elephants in Africa. Due to hunting, to attrition, to the expansion of
Well, my friend,
settlements,
I don't use
agriculture,
Spotify.
those kind of things, the population of African elephants.
I know a lot of people do, but
diminished to around
I don't know.
12.
I like music, and I don't
Come the 80s in Africa, you had
Don't usually use
severe
Spotify.
droughts. Look up.
I don't use Spotify.
droughts. And what
I don't have
happened is in those droughts, a lot of the watering holes that were, that the African
Why am I saying that? I'm just saying that because
animals used dried up.
do you get paid from Spotify? Does Spotify pay music artists? Do they pay the labels
Elephants going to these water holes and
for a number of
they were dried
views?
up. So the elephants died of dehydration, and their carcasses were left just laying on the ground. Well, there was a group, and at some point you can do a podcast where I actually
They
pull
pay
up
by the
studies
listen?
and
Wow.
look at the actual studies.
Really?
But what they found was that an elephant, that's going to be a big specimen laying there underground, right? Within a year, they were pretty
And people
much
use people are on Spotify.
predators and micro.
People like Spotify is like big.
bacteria
I don't have Spotify. I don't have
that
Apple
pretty much
Music.
consume
I don't have any of
skin
that.
and the flesh, and it
I'm not
was
hating on it.
basically just a large
I mean, it
skeleton.
doesn't matter in the day because
Within 4 or
band
5
is
more
in
years, the
pieces.
skeletons were gone.
So let's get the song out
For
there.
whatever
Yeah,
reason,
Apple
they
Music.
weathered away, they
It's
were
crazy, man.
removed, they were eaten. But the skeletons, so it took 5, 6, 7
crazy.
years. And those elephants, which had died and were laying on the ground, their remains were gone. There was no remnant of them left over to find in the fossil record of the future. Unlike the death.
But I do pay for streaming electronic music. I do that.
1,000 years ago. See?
DI.FM.
One of the things
I do
that's gonna
that.
happen is the remains of an animal, once
Yeah,
it dies,
yeah,
has to
touring,
be
exactly.
removed from the processes that would consume it, which means scavengers,
That's a hard life, man.
oxygen. That's important. being
Especially
removed
just
from
starting out.
oxygen, because
Especially when you're in your like fucking
it has
30s.
to be an anoxic environment. because oxygen will accelerate the decay process. And now how do you do that? Well, one of the most effective ways is to bury it rapidly and get it away from the atmosphere. And how do you do that? Well, there's nothing really more effective than a flood, a big flood to do that. Right. So there's that. Then on the other hand, from all over the world...
Yeah, people don't really go to see new bands anymore. They only really go to see old bands
about gigantic
that have already
in the past,
been on the radio.
Floods. Now, to me, it's unfortunate that it's been reduced to this...
Holy shit. Of music? Of playing a song?
And looked at strictly through a religious...
Really? What if you have... That's crazy.
And that's the view that's sort of dominated the Judeo-Christian version of the flood that we find.
So the distributor, they pay for advertisements from Spotify? How does it get to people? It ends up on lists? New release lists? Thanks, man. You don't have to tell the whole process.
Up to the tops of the highest mountains. Now, that's completely scientifically untenable. It's impossible. It could never happen, right? Where did the water come from? Where did the water go? On the other hand, if you have a flood that's measured in, say, hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second peak discharge, well, anybody who survived, who experienced or witnessed such event and managed to survive, their world, not the entire planet uniformly drowned, but their world would be gone.
It's completely drowned.
Completely drowned, yes. Right. And we've looked at imagery where we can see shorelines up 1,000, 11, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet up on mountainsides, right? Well, if somehow you manage by the luck of the draw to be on top of one of those mountains and witness this, yeah, in the aftermath, yeah, the whole world is destroyed. You have no way of knowing what's 100 miles away, 200 miles away, much less what's on the other side of the continent, right? You're deprived of all means of communication.
Oh, wow.
You're deprived of all means
Crazy.
for a while of even being able to move
like
around.
A DJ.
You know, one of the places I take people on tours is called Steptoe Butte in eastern Washington. And it would have been above the floodwaters.
Basically like a DJ, exactly. People pay for the DJ.
But if you manage to take refuge on the top of Steptoe Butte, which is maybe 1,200 feet, I believe, above the surroundings.
Yeah, that's what I pay for with DI.FM, because they... Well, one, they have a lot of live shows, but two, they
is mud. That's what you're going to see. You're going to see.
What's the word? And they choose the best songs.
You know, then you got to wait out until that mud dries out enough that you can actually walk on it.
They won't do it.
But you know, you're walking, and if the nearest other survivors are 100 or 200 miles away, you have no way of knowing that. So that's the thing. So what has happened is because the flood stories were seen just as myths and always over and over again interpreted. Well, you asked anybody, scientist from 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, well, how is it that you have all these people with these flood stories? Well, here's two examples.
From all over the world.
All over the world, right? I think I read the quote from George Caplan at one point, didn't I?
You did, yeah. What is the quote?
The quote about 120 tribes that he visited. They all had, this is in North America, Central America, and South America. They all had traditions of great floods, and their ancestors had survived these great world-destroying floods. Now, how do you explain that?
This is what he said. Here's the quote, Randall, for the people who haven't seen the previous episodes. Amongst the 120 different tribes that I have visited, I have found very few indeed who had not some tradition of a day.
Wow, removed? That's crazy.
Cuts off. Some tradition of a deluge.
Shoot them.
And then I guess the rest of it is not available. Cuts it off whenever I look at it.
Oh, where are you looking at it?
I'm on the Internet Archive right now.
Oh, okay.
Well, anyways, exactly what you said. 20 different
How
tribes.
do you explain it? Well, one is that I've actually seen, and these are, I'm talking about a number of decades ago. But the explanation is
Oh,
they
wow.
obviously heard it from missionaries and then grafted it into
That's
their
crazy.
own religious worldview. Well, wait a second. 120 tribes, a lot of those tribes, he was the first white man that they had
That's
seen.
crazy.
Right? And so some missionary comes there who barely knows their language, if at all. They don't know his language. But he's enabled to convey to them this story of a great flood that makes such an impression upon them that they then incorporate that into their own religious traditions. I just find that whole explanation completely implausible. The other way to get around it is to say, well, it is just an exaggeration of a local or regional flood that in its perpetual telling grew, way beyond the original. So it was through the telling and retelling, the magnitude of this flood became exaggerated. Well, I don't buy that either.
It just builds and builds and builds over the years is what they're saying.
Right. And so if those
Hey, I'm
are the
new.
two, explanations,
Check on my laundry.
what's left
Yeah.
what we now know from the science of paleohydrology.
There was a huge
There have
flood.
been really big floods.
Oh, wow.
Really big ones.
And you mentioned, we were talking about the megafauna earlier as another piece of evidence. What is the common narrative that scientists paint of what happened to the megafauna?
Well, for a long time, it was two things. It would have been the dominant idea since the 60s and the work of Paul C. Martin was the overkill hypothesis. Now, that extended mostly just to the extirpation of the mammoths.
Yeah.
But when we figured that there was somewhere around 100 other megafaunal species that went extinct at the end of the last ice age, did hunters, Paleo-Indian hunters, also exterminate the cave bears? Did they exterminate the dire wolves? Did they exterminate the giant camels? Did they just exterminate the glyptodonts? Did they exterminate, the American Pleistocene lion? Did they exterminate the giant short-faced bear? On and on and on and on and on and on and on. Well, to me, that's, did they hunt these animals? Sure. Yeah. So at one point,
But over 1,000 years, they've killed all of them?
yeah, we've discussed this and made this point. I remember reading a book, Lost America, by anthropologist Frank C. Hibble. And in there he talks about the evidence at this point. It was written actually in the 40s. I don't think it's changed too much since then. The idea of how many creatures. Sorry, gotta turn my phone off here. How many mammoths were there in the world at the peak of, like, during the last late Pleistocene? How many? Well, his estimates were maybe 10 million, 12 million.
Wow.
Maybe that many. We know there was 20 million estimates of African elephants. That doesn't include the Indian elephant, which is really in a way a different species of elephant altogether. So then I thought, okay, let's go with the number 10 or 12 million mammoths. This would have been in North America. This would have been Siberia, Eurasia. They were especially prolific in the now drowned Beringia land bridge that connected Alaska to Siberia. Okay, so then I'm like, okay, what was the population, the human population of the world back then? And I came up with several different estimates from different studies that have been made, and they range from 5 to 10 million people. Okay, let's take the bigger of the two numbers, 10 million people, 10 million mammoths. Okay, so now of those people, we're assuming that little kids aren't out there hunting. The women aren't hunting for the most part. The elderly are not hunting. So you probably got young men, you know, older teenagers up to, 30 or 40 years old. Lifespans were not considered to be, lifespans were considered to be, mid-30s back then. So, how viable, how many hunters did you have worldwide? If the population was 10 million, how many of those people are actually hunting? Maybe a couple of million, generously?
Yeah.
Okay, so that means that if you're gonna, you can work out the numbers. If you've got 1,000 years, even 2,000 years, you've got to exterminate 10 million mammoths. Well, you got to bear in mind too that you can kill a mammoth, let's say here, but over there, 10 miles away, there's a mammoth being born, right? It just doesn't make sense that you would be able to kill off every single viable mammoth capable of perpetuating itself within a couple of thousand years.
Yeah.
That just doesn't make sense.
No,
and it doesn't
doesn't
address the extinction of all those other species. So that's the overkill hypothesis. And the very first time I ever read about that, way back in the 70s, I thought, this doesn't make sense. I didn't know any of the specifics, but it just never made sense to me.
Yeah, and you made a good point too, that if it was just a bunch of overkill, then all of the fossils, skeletons there would be no evidence of megafauna because they
Correct.
wouldn't have been buried under sediment and been preserved by the impact of a flood.
Yes. So, in so many ways, the flood, I think, is of the utmost importance in understanding our own past. And it's and of course, the floods. How do we explain the floods? Well, I think there's three major agencies by which we could have mega floods. One, and this I think is the dominant one, is extremely fast, catastrophic glacial melting on a large scale. And remember the number. How much volume of glacial ice at its peak, the LGM, the late glacial maximum, about 6 million cubic miles. And one of the things I've done on several of the tours we've done is I'll look on a map and we'll try to get on a high hill where we can look off and there's a building or some trees or another hill that's about a mile away. And I say, okay, we're standing here. I want you to look at that. That's a mile away over there. Let's look to our right and find something that's a mile away. And then a mile over our head. Now let's imagine an ice cube that's a cubic mile. That's a lot of water, isn't it? Now, what if all of a sudden we could instantaneously convert that cubic mile ice cube into water? Well, that would be one hell of a big flood, wouldn't it?
Right.
But we're talking about 6 million of those that were sitting up on the earth on the continental land masses of North America and Europe, Eurasia primarily, and it's gone now. It's gone. So how did it go? It melted away. Well, if it melts and it takes 50 or 100,000 years to melt away, well, that's one thing. But if it takes a few thousand years, 3, 4, 5,000 years, that's something completely different. Now, the general melting is considered to be over a span of about 8 to 10,000 years. And I agree with that. But here's the thing. You're not going to get rid of that much ice in a uniform melting of 6 million cubic miles of ice in 8,000 years. Now, what it is looking like is that within that 8 or 9 or 10,000 years, there's at least 2, maybe 3 pulses of orders of magnitude acceleration of the melting rate. So, yes, from the very first discharge from the late glacial maximum, let's say that's 15 or 16,000 years ago, to the final melting away of the residual ice 6 to 7,000 years ago, right? And we know that for a number of reasons, which we don't get into, but one of the main reasons is when we look at sea level rise, because there's a direct relationship between ice melting and sea level rising. When did sea levels reach their modern level? Well, around 6 to 7,000 years ago. So that's a pretty good indication that that was the final melting of the residual ice. Now,
so how much has the sea level changed in the last 6 to 7,000 years? You're saying it's relatively the same.
What it did was it overshot the current level by 4 or 5 feet during the climatic optimum. In other words, glacial ice, there was less glacial ice 7, 8, 9,000 years ago than there is now. That resulted in the period from about 6 to 8,000 years ago, sea levels were 3, 4, 5 feet higher than now. Then they rapidly dropped, and they've been oscillating up a foot, down a foot, basically for the last 5 or 6,000 years. Now,
and why did they rapidly drop?
Well, they would have rapidly dropped because the climate got colder. When
it froze.
Climate got colder, the ice on the land grew. In fact, it depends on where you were in the world, but between roughly 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, there was a climatic transition from the post-glacial climatic optimum, which was warmer than now, into the neo-glaciation period. If you want to look at it in
so I'm going to do a weightlifting stream now.
There was a climate change, and that
I'm gonna do a weightlifting stream now. I appreciate you being here.
And an expansion.
We're gonna raid somebody, but I'm gonna restart stream in 5 minutes or so.
Sea levels drop. So during the climatic
I
optimum,
appreciate that.
the latter phases
You.
of the climatic optimum, sea levels were higher. With the onset of the neoglaciation, they dropped maybe a foot or 2 feet lower than now. And then as we moved into the Little Ice Age, see, we were in the Little Ice Age from, the mid-1800s back to the early 1300s. Well, what happened during the Little Ice Age is that worldwide glaciers swelled. They grew, right? They grew. And if you look at the evidence of the footprints of glaciers in the landscape, what you see is like terminal moraines of the Little Ice Age, show that those were probably the largest that the glaciers had been worldwide since the end of the Great Ice Age. So again, this is something that's never explained or talked about in the global warming hysteria, which is that when we look at the baseline from which we're talking about sea level rise, when we're talking about temperature rise, we're looking at the end of the Little Ice Age. Well, the Little Ice Age had some of the coldest temperatures of the last 10,000 years. So if that's your baseline, yeah, obviously a return to pre-Little Ice Age temperatures it's going to be an upward curve, isn't it? And that's what we're seeing. Now, you add in the urban heat island effect because during the climatic optimum, you didn't have huge urban areas all over the planet like you do now. But when the early data is coming in from average temperatures, like in the early 20th century, or mainly like just in the around the time just pre-Second World War, post-Second World War, excuse me, most of the data is coming from climate sensors that are at airports. Those airports are mostly rural. Back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, those airports were rural. Now what happens when urban infrastructure swallows up those airports? Well, now it's surrounded by buildings, concrete, pavement, air conditioning condenser units that are extruding heat. The urban areas, it's well known, and we should actually do a podcast addressed to this issue of the urban heat island effect, because again, that's being ignored for the most part. But what it shows us is that typically, if you take your average daily temperatures in the urban areas, and then you go 20, 30 miles out into a rural area, there can be as much as 3, 4, or 5 degrees Fahrenheit difference in temperatures, where the cities are warmer than the rural countrysides. This is well established. We could do, I think it would be very instructive to look at that, look at the evidence and the data and the science, because a lot of cities now are actually, for example, New York City has a major program to ameliorate the effects of urban heat islands. For example, making sure that roofs are white rather than dark, planting trees and more vegetation, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So it's a real issue. It's not just something